Let me start by giving you a little background of how all this works. We started coming up to the islands really as a graduate student back in the 80s, when the Nature Conservancy here in the United States hired me for $50 to do a floristic survey of Yellow Island, which I'll mention later in the talk. And I got kind of hooked in the islands. And for those of you who have spent time in the Gulf or San Juan Islands, I think you know how that attachment can just grow, and it never really let go. So here I am, over 40 years since those days, still going up to the islands and enjoying it every bit as much as I did then. So let me start. Native peoples lived for millennia in the islands of the Salish Sea and were intimately familiar with the plants that grew on these islands. They would have known where the salal and supalele could be found in abundance, which species of camas and lily were the most delectable. But it's only in the last couple of centuries that settlers from Western Europe, armed with a scientific perspective on the world, entered this archipelago and started collecting and classifying the flora according to their own rules and perception of the world. They attached their own names to the plants as well as to the islands, often several times over, as testified to by the often mystifying array of both common and scientific names for the same plants, as well as to the multiplicity of names for the islands as well, such as the now mostly forgotten ones shown on this map of what was termed the archipelago of Aro from the Wilkes expedition in 1841. It's a little hard to read on this screen probably, but you can see San Juan Island there is called Rogers Island. Orcas is referred to as Hull's Island. Chauncey's Island was what they call Lopez, all names which are long forgotten. These earliest efforts, whoops, I just jumped a slide there. There we go. These earliest efforts by ship naturalists and professional collectors has continued up to today as botanists, taxonomists, as well as amateur plant enthusiasts sought out and documented the biological richness of the islands. It is the cumulative efforts of these hundreds of individuals that built the foundation for what I will describe to you this evening. So it's only appropriate that I begin my talk with a little overview of these scientists and their work. Yet, much as I love spending time in the islands with the wonderful colleagues seeking out new plants on never visited islands, much of the beauty, mystery, and excitement of this work for me lies in the search for the patterns that help us better understand the world in which we live. This is the realm of island biogeography, a scientific niche that I hope you'll find as fascinating as I have. Before I get fully launched, I want to acknowledge the contributions of two of my colleagues, David Giblin, and I began botanizing together in the San Juans in 2005. And he's been instrumental in curating the large number of herbarium specimens that comprise a significant part of this work that I'll be talking about. Adam Martin is a graduate student and a fellow conservation biologist. He's at Evergreen College in Olympia and has taken on the enormous task of assembling, organizing, cleaning, and analyzing the data files from which this story grows. And those files are pretty voluminous, so it's quite a task. So to help start us all thinking about why the patterns of the plants around us are so intriguing, let's look at three species of plants that, despite all our searching, we've been completely unable to find growing anywhere in the San Juans. Western Trillium, vine maple, and common paintbrush are the three that I'm going to start out talking about here. The distribution of Western Trillium provides a good example to start with. The points on this map show where this species has been collected throughout the region, as documented by herbarium specimens. You can see readily inside this circle here that it's conspicuously absent from both the San Juan and Gulf Islands. Biogeography is a big field, and one area that particularly absorbs us is trying to understand why these sort of distribution patterns exist. Why do these plants occur in one area but are completely absent from another? For example, with the Trillium, one possible explanation regards the seeds, which are dispersed by ants. So it's perhaps not unexpected that no ants have yet succeeded in swimming out to the islands while clutching a Trillium seed in their mandibles. But the same explanation doesn't apply to vine maple, which, as I'm sure most of you know, has seeds that are readily carried by the wind. This map shows a similar distribution as Trillium, although unlike that species, it's largely absent from Vancouver Island. And of course, there's that one lone dot on Galiano Island. Can you see me pointing to it there? Over here, I guess. I puzzled about that occurrence for a while, but thanks to the wonders of the internet, I was able to take a close look at the herbarium label for that specimen, which perhaps offers a clue. It appears that the Bennetts who collected this specimen spent a bit of time collecting around the hummingbird pub, where this species almost certainly had been planted. So I think it's still missing from the island. The third species, common red paintbrush, provides yet another similar example that is even more puzzling. As you can see from this map, the species is quite common everywhere in the region, but despite having extremely tiny seeds that are carried by the wind and by any number of animals, it has never found its way out to any of the islands. As with the maple, there's one lone dot, this time an 1895 collection on Main Island. So they're right there. But again, inspection of the herbarium specimen shows a different sort of error. The original identification was incorrect. The specimen is clearly Cattleya hispida, the harsh paintbrush, and this mistake was confirmed and corrected with a later annotational label that you can see down here in the bottom. There are actually many more besides these three species that are well known on the mainland, but are absent or very rare in the San Juans. Here's just a sampling of a few of them, many of which are forest understory species. And in the coming months, we're eager to explore more deeply what various factors may account for the absence or scarcity of these sort of species in the islands. We'll be looking at dispersal mechanisms, the type of seeds they have, the habitats they occur in, and so forth, to see if they start showing similar patterns. These three examples introduce a few basic questions about our work that I will explore along the way as I take you on this botanical wandering through the islands. The first question is a simple one. How can we possibly document all the plants that grow in the islands? We're currently up to around 1,138 species and counting, on somewhere around 160 of the about 475 islands, depending on what you call an island, that are supposed to occur in the San Juans. A second closely related question is, how do we know if the data we get are accurate? That is, was that species correctly identified? And as I'll talk about over the course of this discussion, that can be a challenge as well, particularly when you're working with material that you haven't seen yourself. And a third question is, how do we know if our lists for each island are complete? Which for many of the questions that we're trying to ask is an important assumption, is that the list of species we have for a particular island is all the species that actually occur on that island. And I'll touch on all three of these questions over the course of the evening. So let's touch on that first question by talking about how we've gone about developing a comprehensive understanding of the plants that grow on many of the islands in this archipelago. The story begins with a ship's surgeon, and like any good story, it involves a bit of a mystery. The first specimen we know of from this area is a Kamchatka fritillary, collected in 1792 by Archibald Menzies, the doctor/naturalist, as was often the case, aboard the Vancouver expedition. The specimen is labeled as coming from Orcas Island, but no other records of this species have ever turned up in the islands since that time. And if it did indeed exist here, it seems likely that it has gone extinct. Our next records come from the mid-1850s when David Lyle, a Scottish botanist, made his way through the islands while assisting with the survey of the US-Canadian border. His few collections from the islands included 2 species from Orcas, where, once again, the mysteries linger. Neither Crocidium multiculi, gold stars or spring gold as it's sometimes called, nor Mechanella oregana, the Oregon Mechanella, have ever been documented on Orcas again. The Crocidium turned up once more in 1992 on San Juan Island, but has not been reported there or anywhere else in the San Juan since then. The Mechanella was only just rediscovered in the early 2000s, this time on San Juan Island. And a third species collected by Lyle, Origion speciosus, the showy fleabane, which he found on Lopez, was not seen again in the islands until we found a couple of plants of it on San Juan just last year, 170 years later. I think you're probably starting to see a pattern here. Over the next 100 years, various botanists came and went, making collections that mostly were from the big ferry-served islands that were easiest to get to in those days. Their collections gradually accumulated in various herbaria throughout the West Coast, as well as back east, and even a few of them made their way to England. And up until recently, these specimens comprised much of what we know about the flora of the islands. By far, the biggest jump in our understanding occurred with the seminal work in the 1980s and early 90s of Scott Atkinson and Fred Sharp, which they published in their Flora of the San Juan Islands. Fred was just an undergraduate at the University of Washington in the early 80s when he began this work. And I was also a student there at that time, working on my doctoral degree. And I remember Fred well, wandering into the herbarium now and again with some of his latest finds from the islands. Although he and Scott didn't do a lot of collecting, they were very keen botanists and traveled widely in the islands, particularly on the larger ones, and their work remains the only attempt to publish a comprehensive flora for the archipelago, and it's really quite complete. This finally brings us to our own studies, where we've begun to take a broader look at how species are distributed across the entire array of islands. This effort required developing detailed inventories of all the species that occur on as many islands as we could come up with. We began these studies in earnest, as I mentioned, in 2005, when David Gibbelin and I organized a series of forays to document the floras on the smallest islands, most of which had never been previously inventoried at all. By focusing on islands up to about 50 acres or so, and visiting them 2 or 3 times in different seasons, we tried to make comprehensive collections of their entire floras. By 2009, after about 5 years of collecting, we had visited a total of about 80 islands. I made another major push in the 2017-2018 interval with an additional round of surveys to inventory the floras on 60 more islands in the San Juan Islands National Monument. Most recently, I've begun working with several colleagues to expand on our earlier studies by focusing on some of the medium and larger sized islands. Documenting the floras on the largest islands has required a somewhat different approach than we used on these smallest islands, and I'll speak about that a bit later. So to answer the first question, up until the last few years, we've relied almost entirely on dried plant specimens in herbaria collected by ourselves and our many predecessors to document the island floras. By making multiple visits in different seasons, as I said, to these small islands, we think we got pretty close to documenting every species that occurred, at least during the year that we were collecting on each island. What we've discovered as we go back to some of these islands is that the floras on these islands is by no means constant. And especially in islands where there's people camping or geese nesting, things like that, a lot of species disappear and a lot of new species show up. But I'm getting ahead of myself with the story here. So as a quick summary then, before we started our collecting in 2005, we had information derived from about 5,100 specimens collected mostly from the larger islands by the early botanists. Between 2005 and 2018, this number approximately doubled, mostly a coincidence there, with our work on about 140 smaller islands. These range from a 1 meter square rock with one plant on it to Peitos and Vendovi Island, both of which are somewhat a little over 200 acres with several hundred species on each of them. This gives you a sense of how and where much of our data comes from. Now let me touch briefly on the second question of how we know the information we're gathering is correct. The gold standard will always be a voucher specimen in an herbarium. If the only evidence we had was just what someone described in their notes or left for us on a plant list, we'd often end up hopelessly confused. Without being able to look at the actual Mechanella specimen collected by David Lyle, we likely would have little certainty regarding what species he really observed. Again, since we haven't been able to find it on the island where he did ever since. Here you can see a specimen collected by William Moody at Friday Harbor in 1910. And as it turns out, was misidentified by Professor Fry, who was running the lab at that time. After being examined by another number of subsequent botanists, you can see the different annotations on the label. This collection is now recognized as the type specimen of what we call Micranthes integrifolia today. So you can see how if we just have a name on a list from William Moody and nothing else, it would have been totally incorrect and we would not know that the type specimen, or the original occurrence of that species was from this site. In our biogeographical studies, we occasionally must rely on reports of species without voucher specimens, but we do so cautiously and not without some trepidation. We have a bit more confidence where the source of a report is a particularly reliable expert and the occurrence seems likely, but not only do experts make mistakes, as you can see with this collection, but our interpretation of species changes over time as well. A perfect example of this regards this pair of species, which many of you may recognize as harvest brodia, a common plant that blooms later in the spring, early summer than much of our spring flora. This pair of species, Brodia coronaria and Brodia rosea, the latter, Brodia rosea, was long considered a subspecies of Brodia coronaria and was thought to be confined to serpentine bedrock areas in northern and central California. Taxonomic studies just published in 2013 determined these were actually two distinct species and that both of them occurred here in our region. So of course we dashed out to re-examine all our old records, the specimens we'd collected of harvest, what we called harvest brodia from the San Juans, and sure enough, some of them were indeed Brodia rosea. Without the specimens to examine, we would have been unable to tease out which islands these two species actually occurred on. This Brodia example provides a nice segue to plant disjunctions, where the distributions of species leap long distances with gaps in between. This is another large and pretty fascinating to me realm that rests under the large umbrella of biogeography. We've already talked about one kind of gap in the distributions of species, those that grow all around the San Juans, but not in the islands themselves. Brodia rosea provides a different example, illustrating a species that exhibits a much larger gap in its distribution, shown here on the left. It occurs in California and Southern Oregon. California is sort of cropped off the bottom of here, but it makes its way down into the northern part of the state. In what plant geographers refer to as the California floristic province, which I don't know if the Oregonians appreciate that designation, but it includes the Siskiyous and the Klamath area of southwestern Oregon. But then it leaps several hundred miles all the way up to Puget Sound. And it contrasts, the distribution of that species contrasts pretty markedly with that of Brodia coronaria, which you can see is fairly continuous all the way through that entire coastal area. So we've identified just a handful of these California disjuncts in the San Juans, and all of them pose pretty intriguing puzzles. How do species end up occupying such disparate interrupted ranges? The plants on the list are from different families. Generally, they're pretty small plants, and they include both annuals and perennials. The map showing the distribution of Crassula cannata, the what's that common name there? Sand pygmy weed. You can see in the middle of this figure, is fairly typical of all of them, although several, like the lupin and the peppergrass that are also illustrated here, have even greater disjunctions, with no occurrences in Oregon at all. And the San Juan plants of these populations of those two species are separated by 700 miles from their nearest California populations, which are down in the San Francisco area. I don't know if that font is too small for you to read, but California broom rape up there in the upper left, annual species of clover in the middle there, the little lupin that I mentioned. It's kind of an intriguing one. It looks very much like Lupinus bicolor, the little annual lupin that's common in many areas. But this population consists of about 16 plants on a little remote island that nobody ever gets to, fairly near Yellow Island, which again, I'll talk about in a bit. The Crassula cannata, the pygmy weed, is a tiny little thing. You can see it's smaller than your finger. The Microceros bigelovii, the coastal silver puff, again, a tiny little plant. The Lepidium oxycarpum, the peppergrass. Until this year, we only knew it from growing in a crevice on one bedrock outcrop at Cattle Point in the southeast corner of San Juan Island. Then we found it later growing on an island just offshore that nobody ever visits. And then the California buttercup, which is a much showier one than our Western buttercup that we see so frequently. While the California disjuncts are among the most distant that occur in the San Juans, many others of equal interest occur as well. Among the larger groups of disjunct species include those that are found largely east of the Cascade, such as the Pacific popcorn flower up here in the upper right. Species from the intermontane west, Nevada, Utah, and that sort of area, such as the contorted pod suncup, this little guy up here in the middle of the top. And plants from boreal and montane habitats, either all the way up into Alaska or out into the Rocky Mountains in Idaho and Montana. And these include things like the showy polemonium or showy Jacob's ladder in the upper left here, one of the saxifrages in the lower left, and this Oxypterpus in the pea family in the lower right. Collecting specimens to thoroughly and accurately document the floras worked pretty well for the smaller islands. But starting about 3 years ago, we began to think about how we might be able to accomplish this on bigger islands as well. One change we decided on after a lot of thought was to photograph many of the species we came across and only make collections of species that are either difficult to identify or impossible to identify if you're just using a photograph. We posted our photos using the natural history app iNaturalist that I hope many of you are familiar with, and its associated website. And these changes made our records permanently available and readily available to others, just who have an internet connection. And this transition also greatly expedited our survey process because we were no longer having to collect hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of specimens to document what we were seeing. Little quiz here, which you can put in the chat later. Anybody know what that plant is on the right there, middle right? I think you can see where I'm circling. That one had me stumped for a while because I'd never looked at it that closely, but it's got kind of intriguing little fruits. Using this modified approach, we began to tackle islands like Susha and Burrows, both of which are in the 500-acre range. And Susha, you can see up here in the upper north end of the archipelago, and Burrows right down here next to Anacortes. And we continued to refine our strategies as we expanded our work to include larger islands, Blakely and Cyprus there, and then on to include Orcas, San Juan, Lopez, Shaw, and some of the other larger islands. We also began to explore crowdsourcing this project by tapping into the rapidly growing archive of thousands of photos that have been submitted by the general public to iNaturalist in the last few years. This is a very rapidly developing field. iNaturalist has algorithms that can help identify species. It doesn't always get them right, but it can help even relatively inexperienced plant advocates come up with a name. But of course, caution is essential if we're going to use these to ensure that the records are correctly identified. And if there's any doubt, if it's a blurry photograph, so forth, I won't include those on our list. But there, as many of you probably know, a lot of plants can be pretty solidly identified just from a photograph. The other problem with iNaturalist photos is it can be challenging at times to determine whether what you're looking at is a wild plant or something that was planted in somebody's yard. And again, if there's any question, I tend to not include those plants. And oftentimes you'll see a house or a fence or a tomato plant in the background and know that you're looking at something that maybe somebody planted and that hasn't, it's not growing in the wild. I'll talk more about these larger island floras in a little bit. But first, I want to try and address the third question I posed, which was how can we know if our species lists are reasonably complete? As you'll see shortly, that question also dovetails nicely with one of the fundamental questions that has long been debated by biogeographers studying organisms on islands. How does the number of species vary among islands of different sizes? We can try to answer both questions using a graph called a species area curve. And here's a simple species area graph showing the number of species found on each island. For this example, I'm just including the smaller islands that we studied. And the number of species shown on the vertical axis ranges from 1 to nearly 300. And it's plotted against the area of each island, which is shown in hectares on the horizontal axis. And here I've sketched in a line to help you better visualize the shape of the species area curve, but it's not really all that informative. The main pattern that emerges here, and one that's not particularly surprising, is that bigger islands have more species. But there are a couple of problems with this graph that obscure considerable information. First of all, as you can see, most of the data points are so jammed together towards the left-hand edge that it's almost impossible to see if there are any interesting patterns present among the smallest islands. And second, we clearly need to get some more points in this range of islands larger than about 20 hectares. It's hard to define a curve with such a few number of islands. So to make things a little clearer, I've plotted exactly the same data that was in that previous graph, but this time on a graph where the horizontal axis here, uses a logarithmic rather than a linear scale. And that just means that these vertical lines, you can see here, each one is 10 times larger than the previous one. And what this does is it stretches out the whole left-hand side of the graph so that you can actually see what's going on with all these small islands, how many species do they have. And it sort of compresses the data points from larger islands. Now we can see something that island biogeographers have been studying with many different organisms all around the world in lots of different island systems, from lizards to insects to birds, you name it. When the data are plotted with island area on a logarithmic axis like this, as I've shown here, the data points generally fall along a straight line. And it's not a perfect fit, of course. There's always going to be some variability in nature. But this isn't just some nifty statistical trick. There's actually a lot we can learn about plants and islands by studying a graph like this and recognizing that they will form this sort of a straight line. For starters, this helps us answer the question as to whether we may be missing a lot of species on an island. If a point falls considerably below the line, for example, that one there, this is Colville Island off the south shore of Lopez, it seems to have about 55 fewer species than we might expect if we project it up to the line itself. So we might want to take a closer look at that island and see why it's seems to be missing so many species. Here you can see where it is. It's an 11-acre island sitting in a pretty exposed location where Rosario Strait and the Strait of Juan de Fuca intersect, just off the southeast corner of Lopez. And it presents a fairly barren aspect compared with many of the nearby islands. But what almost certainly explains its currently depauperate flora is the fact that I teased out again, scouring the internet, trying to learn whatever I could about this obscure little island. And it turns out that back in the 1970s, it supported a colony of over 1,800 nesting pairs of gulls. And although the gulls completely abandoned the island, there's no nesting pairs there anymore. Nesting birds have impart immense impacts to the flora of these islands. And these impacts are almost certainly going to persist for decades, if not centuries, fertilizing the islands from their guano, tearing out the vegetation, smothering it. There's a lot of disturbance. In fact, based on our data from many of the other small islands, we've concluded that nesting candidate geese, which you may be surprised to learn are a race that's not actually even native to the islands, pose one of the greatest threats to the unique floras on these small islands.
Peter, Jennifer, my geologist friend, was asking whether you have done correlation with rock types, underlying geology.
I won't talk about that this evening, but yes, that's definitely something we're looking at. The one thing I will mention is that Serpentine, which I mentioned, the brodia rosea occurring on in California, does occur in the San Juans, particularly on Burroughs Island, which I mentioned near Anacortes, and Cypress Island, one of the big islands nearby. And there's a number of species that primarily just occur on Serpentine, and sure enough, they occur on those islands, nowhere else. We're trying to correlate other rock types with other plant distribution patterns in the islands. But as you may know, the geology of the islands is extremely complex and can vary tremendously over a very short distance. So being able to confidently describe what the rock type is that underlies a particular small island can be challenging at times. Let's look at a second outlier, one that is similar in size to Colville, but is positioned far above the line. This is Yellow Island, the island that I mentioned before that got me started in the San Juans back in 1981. And it appears to have about 80 more species than we might have expected, completely the opposite situation than Colville. In this aerial view of Yellow Island, it's a preserve that belongs to the Nature Conservancy, what immediately stands out is how many different sorts of habitats it has, especially for such a small island. The main ones are readily visible even from this distance, and I've circled them here. I'll click through them. They include beaches, rocky shorelines and bedrock outcrops, shrub patches, grassy balds, or meadows, I think as you may call them more in British Columbia, and forested habitats. So this suggests that a high diversity of habitats may be just as important as island area in explaining why some islands may have more species than others. But before we move on to the largest islands, let's look at one other outlier that, like Yellow Island, also falls well above the projected line. This is Trial Island, a wonderful little gem near the entrance to Victoria Harbor that may be familiar to some of you, and also has 75 or 80 more species than we might expect. Thanks to the generosity of Matt Fairbarns and some of my Canadian colleagues, I've been fortunate enough to visit Trial Island several times, and it's truly a stunning place. It's so remarkable. I'm just aghast every time I set foot on that island. It simply has an astonishing number of species, and it includes nearly every rare species that we found on all the small islands we surveyed put together. However, it doesn't fit the pattern of high habitat diversity corresponding with greater numbers of species that I just talked about on Yellow Island. I circled the shrub habitats on Trial Island in green here, which are interspersed among the brown patches of grassy coastal bald habitat. And most of the rest of the island consists simply of bedrock outcrops, which gives you about 3 habitats if you describe them in those ways. Clearly, there's something more than just habitat diversity in island area that can result in islands having a large number of species. And as we just mentioned, geology certainly is one of them. Land use history is another. Geographic location, microclimate, and probably a number of others that I'm not thinking of right now. Access by wildlife, how readily deer can swim out to them and so forth, all can factor into affecting species diversity. So I'm going to turn one last time to the species area graph, but now I've added in data that we've just been compiling in this last year. So this is still a work in progress, fresh off the press, if you will. I've included points for the largest San Juan islands, Orcas, Lopez, San Juan, Shaw, as well as a few points for 3 large Canadian islands, including Galiano, kindly supplied by my colleague Andrew Simon, and Maine and Saturna, which is data that represents some of the fine work carried out by the late Canadian botanist Harvey Jansen. These data are, like I said, still preliminary, but they're beginning to suggest that the largest islands, perhaps those over about 4,500 acres, about here, are exhibiting a pattern that's unlike the smaller islands, that is characterized by a line with a much steeper slope. Here I've sketched in one here in red, and you can see it's quite a bit steeper to intersect the different islands than what we've plotted through all the smaller islands there. This would suggest that the number of species on these larger islands increases at a much more rapid rate than they do for the smaller islands, so that there must be other factors than what dictate the number of species on the small islands that characterizes species diversity on the big islands. While the data we've gathered so far point to both island area and habitat diversity as important factors, we're still trying to fully understand what explains this fairly radically different slope of the lines for the big islands. The graph also helps in assessing how completely we have surveyed the floras. Remember, that was one of the fundamental questions that we're always trying to figure out. And this is especially important with these large islands where it's simply impossible to visit every last little corner of an island that is several tens of thousands of acres, and much of it being private land that we may not have access to. So you may have noticed, for example, if we take a look at Lopez, it falls well below the projected line, suggesting that it may be somewhere around 200 species or so short of where we might expect it to be, to have. And indeed, Lopez has not been botanized nearly to the extent that's been carried out on Orcas and San Juan Island, that where the early collectors especially concentrated most of their efforts. This may reflect a considerably lower diversity of habitats on Lopez, if habitat is a major factor deciding that diversity, or it may represent other things, land use history. A lot of that island was farmed, or there may be different geology, or maybe other factors altogether. I'd like to finish up by talking a bit about some of the rare species on the islands, just briefly here. Overall, there are about 25 taxa that are officially considered rare from a state or federal perspective on the American side of the border. This includes Victoria's owl clover, which occurs on a single island in the San Juans in a patch about the size of a couple of dinner tables. The population has varied between about 68 plants to about 6,000 or so. It's a little annual that, like many other annuals, varies hugely in population size depending on the year. It also occurs, perhaps not surprisingly, on Trial Island and a few other places in the world. There's a few small sites on the very southeast corner of Vancouver Island, and that's the world's distribution of that species. There are also many that have not been documented in over a century and may well be extirpated entirely from the islands, such as the rosy owl clover and the rough-leaved aster shown here. The rosy owl clover, again, occurs on Trial Island, but does not occur anywhere else now in the San Juans and hasn't been seen in over just about 100 years, 1923. There are many more species that are rarely encountered in the islands, even though they may be relatively common elsewhere. We've talked about a few of those. Some of these disjuncts that I mentioned earlier, California buttercup and the big potted lupin are examples of that. So let me wrap up there and close with a plea, perhaps, or perhaps maybe it's a challenge to all of you, that the flora of the islands has been changing for thousands of years and will continue to do so. And as we strive to protect the remarkable diversity in this area, the first step is really to understand what we already have. And together with partners on both sides of the border, we've been we've come a long way in developing this understanding, but there's really much that a lot of folks like yourselves can do to help further this process. I'd especially encourage you to see if you can discover species that have been largely or entirely overlooked, or that we've concluded have been extirpated from the islands. In the coming months, we'll be compiling lists of these sort of species for some of the San Juans to give anyone with a keen botanical eye some specific targets to seek out. And in addition, we'll be collaborating with some of our Canadian colleagues to compile similar lists for some of the Gulf Islands as well. When you discover something not known from an island, you can document it carefully with a few clear photographs and upload them to iNaturalist. You get to sit back and bask in the warm glow of your discovery, and science benefits with one more data point for one more species from one more island. So let me finish by thanking the many agencies, organizations, friends and colleagues, some of whom are with us this evening, that have assisted in so many ways during this long journey through the islands. We really wouldn't be where we are today without the help of so many people and organizations. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.